I decided this time because of the translation, to have something, that people, the main things, the main stuff. Because I noticed that people speak so fast, translators cannot catch everything. So at least to have the main stuff on slide. What? It was most of the time good, but they couldn't catch everything because they were going so fast. People speak so fast. Just it's not normal. It's just how it is. Because we have to respect them. I mean, it's really hard when you simultaneously translate. I mean, to catch all the words. So sometimes they stop in the middle of the sentence and then cannot continue. It's understandable.
Merhaba, konferansımızın bugünün ikinci oturumuna hoş geldiniz. Bu arada sunumların, sizinki Türkçe değil mi?
Evet, Türkçe.
Sunumların ikisi İngilizce olacağı için dışarıda konferans alanında simultane tercüme kulaklıkları var, onlardan alabilirsiniz. Bu oturumda 3 farklı hoca, 3 farklı ülkeden katıldı bize. ZILKA, SPAHIC, pronunciation'a bakmak lazım. SPAHIC-SILJAK, Bosna'dan geliyor. Ramazan hocam Avusturya'dan katılıyor. Profesör ASMA Barlas da Amerika'dan katıldı programımıza. Vakit çalmamak adına hemen ZILKA ile başlayalım. Bu arada ZILKA'nın, just a minute. ZILKA, Balkanlar'da din ve İslami feminist bilgi üretiminin sürecini anlatacak. Yeah, you should miss that. It's not working? It's not on. Yes, it's on.
It's on. Hello everyone. I hope it works now. I'm glad to be here with you today, and I feel privileged to share some of my work and experiences. And I would like to thank the organizer of this conference and kind invitation, particularly from Professor Caner and FERYAL TASLAMAN, and other in the team of this conference, and Bahçeşehir University to hosting all of us. I'll be speaking today about religion and feminist production of knowledge in the Balkans semi-periphery, and I will explain all of these terms at the beginning of my presentation. So in the first part of my presentation, I will discuss the dynamic of inclusion and exclusion in knowledge production between the Center-West and the Balkans semi-periphery. In the second part of my presentation, I will talk about the rise of religious feminism and the initiatives of Muslim and Christian women who advocated for gender equality in that region. And in the third part, I will refer briefly to the 3 successful models and initiatives that enable productive dialogue and activism. The first one is Women Believers and Citizens Initiative. The second one is Feminism and Religion School. And the third one is University and Gender Resource Center that we established at the University of Sarajevo with 18 universities in the Balkans region, gathering Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro. So at the beginning, I would like to remind all of us what word feminism stands for. What is feminism? Is this feminism, is it about women who are disobedient, who wears mustaches, who wants to expel men and rule over men, as we usually see these kind of arguments? I would say no. Feminism is an idea, it's a movement, but also a theory, and it goes against sexism, oppression, exploitation, and marginalization. Believe me, women don't want to rule over men. They want to rule over their own lives and over their own bodies. So, when we look back a bit in the last 40 years, we can see, for instance, in the 1970s, especially in the United States, that they have started to question the mainstream knowledge production. And first of all, in sociology, anthropology, and other disciplines, they started adding women's perspective to the existing building of patriarchy. But very soon, they realized this is not enough. It's not going to work. This is not a solution. So, women scholars said, for the knowledge to be called feminist knowledge, it should question the power asymmetry, to empower women, to shake the foundations of patriarchy, to change the status quo, and to advocate for emancipatory gender policies, to use gender as analytical category, and to interpret the world from women's perspective. But to do that, feminist theoreticians and scholars take into account body, experience, and emotions as source of knowledge. And of course, as Donna Haraway and other scholars noticed and reminded us, the knowledge is always situated, and the context matters a lot. The world and the international politics, education, and economy in general operate on a variety of dualisms. And on one hand, we have secular religious divide that marked the second half of 20th century and the beginning of 21st century. On the other hand, we have appearance of religiously based feminists and initiatives, to question that. Many scholars, even today, insist on the existence of secular religious divide characterized by irreconcilable secular and religious perspective when we talk about gender equality. So we have antagonism between religion and secularism, as well as between secular and religious feminists. They continue to put in opposition the two. But as John Bala Scott, an American historian, said, they are discursively codependent, because she explains after the French Revolution, women didn't get full emancipation. They won suffrage rights, right to education, workforce, even to be politically engaged, but they are still struggling to obtain full emancipation and participation in public life and in every segment of life. So this was not enough. But there was a wide gap between what was specified by legislation and results in practice. We have disparity, and in some regions, like in the Balkans, where we have important intersection of gender, religion, nationality, ethnic identity, and especially, you know, after the war in 1990s and in the post-war context, we had to address gender equality issues intersectionally, taking into account all of these identities. So one of the ways to examine the interplay between secular and religious feminism is to add what Immanuel Wallerstein calls the world zones. He divides the world into 4 zones. The center, of course, is the West. This is the core. And then there is periphery. This is outskirts of Europe, where the Balkans belong. And there are external arenas, 2 external arenas. So the Balkans is kind of a semi-periphery. Sometimes it is easier to be periphery than the semi-periphery. You are Europe, but not real Europe. So the Balkans is a semi-periphery, as I said, to the Western center, but within the Balkans semi-periphery itself, religious, feminist, academic, and civil society discourses are the periphery. Secular feminism as periphery of secularism shows similar behavior in its own discourse and activism to its center. In the semi-periphery of Western secularist scholarship is Western liberal feminism, which, as Chandra Mohanty, an American scholar, points out, often legitimizes the liberated Western women versus oppressed third world women, which has effect of supporting existing power asymmetry that contribute to the very cycle of oppression they've been trying to eradicate. So I want to contribute to this debate of inclusion and exclusion between the center and semi-periphery with the relations, or better to say lack of relations, between secular and religious feminisms. My thesis and my main argument is that the knowledge production in the Balkans semi-periphery is artificially divided between secular and religious feminist circles. Just as feminists from the center marginalize feminists in the Balkans with neo-colonial approaches and the cultural hegemony, secular feminists in the semi-periphery ignore religious feminism. So we have the circle of marginalization. It is important also to note that while secular civil society organizations, in many cases in that region, especially after 1990s, after the war, they created a space for gender and religion debate. They integrated these topics into their discussion. But at the same time, they didn't support it that these teams become integral part of academic life, to become official academic courses or part of the courses. And this is because, Canan mentioned it in her own presentation, because of the disconnection between scholarship and practice. And as Mohanty, I'm quoting her again, said, you know, if we basically disconnect the two, if we academicians sit only in our classrooms and do not check and test our theories in the field, we basically support politicization of practice. So the two should go hand in hand. Now, I want to say something about the top-down approach that we have in that region. So, torn by contradictory impulses from the semi-periphery and the center, gender theoretical and activist development hasn't been recognized in full capacity. Most academic researchers and activists are funded by foreign donors, so we have donor politics. And they don't want to share that piece of funding with religious feminists. So this is one part of the problem. But also the post-war context of the Balkans, which is not yet part of EU, it is on its own way to EU accession, is burdened with huge poverty, nationalism, ethnic and religious homogenization, religious conservatism. All these problems affect also this topic. So these countries are under huge pressure, on one hand, to pursue modernization and become part of the core of the West, and at the same time, to maintain traditional, cultural, and religious values. On one hand, there is the Western secular paradigm that strives to assimilate all local efforts in the semi-periphery for gender equality into a particular framework, mostly liberal feminist framework, with emphasis on civil and political rights and individual freedom without social and economic rights that women in Yugoslavia had very well resolved. On the other hand, there is a local culture that is heavily impregnated with customs and religious norms that govern especially family lives and consequently women's lives. So, and they both had impact on epistemological and civic framework development. So it has to be taken into account that knowledge production goes hand in hand with capital and language hegemony. In the last couple of years, knowledge production has also been influenced by religious fundamentalism, visible especially in Catholic churches around Europe, but also in some Muslim communities. So we have to be cautious about power relations and privileges of the center that dictates the science and research trends, that legitimizes epistemic frameworks we have to comply and follow, and also what they exclude and what they include. So feminists from the Balkans region collaborate with Western feminists, but power relations dictate these relations in the way from the center. Many secular feminists have access to funding, resources, jobs in academia, etc., while religious feminist scholars are completely marginalized. Some religious feminists in the Balkans are even persecuted as gender ideologists, which is the case especially in Croatia by the Catholic Church, because every attempt to make the changes, to shake the foundation of patriarchy, goes with labels that these women are going against family, against tradition, cultural and religious norms, against their own churches and their own religious communities. Men, I have to say, are mostly silent because they think that gender equality is not their own business. But it is. It is your business as it is our business. So, religiously based feminism in the Balkans started in small circles of scholars in the late 70s, primarily within the Catholic tradition, because after the Second Vatican Council from 1965, they had more room to work on that. But before 1990s, neither Orthodox Christian nor Muslims had anything that could be categorized as feminist theology. So just as secular feminism was available mostly to academic circles at universities in former Yugoslavia, religious feminism was also visible only among scholars focused on liberation theology in Catholic tradition, and also later liberation theology in Muslim traditions. So feminist and religious identities were highly contested. And being a feminist was not acceptable, but being a religious feminist is inconceivable still today, especially when you go somewhere and say you are Islamic or Muslim feminist, people cannot put two together. So the socialism in former Yugoslavia, in the Balkans region, didn't support autonomous movement, including the feminist movement, in that region, because it had a limited understanding of freedom, because gender equality was imposed top-down from the state, and the state wanted to control feminist work. And because they believed that women's question was resolved by the socialist state. There was no other question to be discussed. As religion was marginalized from public life, the socialist state didn't want to do anything with religion in public life, including religious feminism. However, that's been changed in 1990s when religion was revived and when the socialist ideology was replaced by ethno-national ideology and ethno-religious ideology that used a religion as a powerful tool to mobilize people for wars, and they are still at power. Religious feminists remained excluded, and they experienced triple marginalization by the state, secular state, by secular feminists, and by their own religious communities and churches. And who would want to be a feminist when you have triple marginalization? So it's a hard work. Now I'm going to say something about secular conception of knowledge, how it is imposed to all of us. Western secular epistemological discourse exports neutral and objective scientific arguments requiring everyone from the semi-periphery to comply with these standards, shaped by specific vocabulary and writing styles that diminish all the richness of local style and framework of argumentation. So certain feminist discourses, particularly those that are religiously based, are considered backwards, an obstacle to equality and freedom within the local context, and are not taken into account at all. In her critique of secularism and liberalism, late anthropologist Saba Mahmood, probably you are aware of her work, discovers how secularism as socio-cultural project imposes a liberal privatized model of religiosity with a number of presuppositions about freedom and autonomy of an individual. The liberal conception of autonomy assumes that the person is capable of enacting her own desire from the force of transcendental will, tradition, and custom. Furthermore, secularized conception of religiosity consider rituals and scripture inessential to the universal truth it symbolizes. Liberal feminists, therefore, cannot understand and accept, for instance, a Muslim woman as autonomous subject with free will to submit to God when she covers her head and practices modesty in clothing. So it is not acceptable. So if state institutions, especially educational institutions, want to eradicate discriminatory practices and stereotypes, they should include religious feminist perspective into its gender equality policies and practice, because religious norms intertwined with cultural norms, as we heard many times during the panels, in fact, govern the lives of many women in this and other regions. Keeping in mind the Balkan semi-periphery context in which ethnic divisions very often overlap with religious divisions and ethnic religious identity mostly correspond with each other, it is crucial to enable more connections between feminist production of knowledge and feminist practice to avoid exclusion and marginalization, those who do not follow the dictate of liberalism and secularized liberal religious subject. Secular feminists ignore religious feminist work and efforts to deconstruct nature-culture dichotomy. There is a rich literature of theological anthropology in Christianity and Islam, which is rooted in secular philosophical arguments about nature of women and men. They are heavily influenced by Aristotelian dualism and division between the soul and body, ratio and emotions, etc. But as John Scott notices, secularists just replaced God with nature and natural law that from Aristotelian time till today legitimizes nature, culture, dichotomy, and subjugation of a woman to a man. So basically, we have the same arguments in secular sphere as we have in religious sphere. So what to do? How to bridge that gap? We have seen that there are multiple exclusions and power relations in knowledge production, but that didn't completely diminish the work of religious feminists in this region. Within the broader secular feminist movement, there were a few niches, few pockets where religious feminism survived and even flourished over time, especially after 1990s. Some women, including myself, have decided to create the agenda and not to wait the other to do it for them. We refused to be an object of the debate, but we wanted to create the debate. We didn't want to be constantly in defensive position to defend ourselves for being Muslims, waiting for others to be invited somewhere to speak. We created platforms and we invited others to join us. So this is the way, not to be in defensive position constantly. It's tiring. We managed to include religion as one of the topics, not the most important and not the only one, but as one of them. So I'm going to just briefly say a few words. Do I have time? Okay. Few words about these three initiatives. The first one, we called it Women Believers and Citizens. It is a unique program launched in 2006 in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Serbia, and other Balkans countries with the support of UN Women. We managed to produce training material for women. It started as a grassroots activism, and then we moved it to academia. So the aim was to bridge the gap between secular and religious understanding of human rights and gender equality. And we used the framework of CEDAW Convention, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and UN Security Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. This was the international framework, and also the framework of religious traditions of Christianity and Islam. So it was the first comparative studies of women's rights within the feminist theological framework, and now it is important material in local languages in the Balkans, and it is literature for the courses at universities. So it started as a civil society initiative and became an important part of the academic teaching. From 2016, Ecumenical Women's Initiative from Croatia, it's a big international organization that gathers women from all religious traditions, continue these trainings all around the region, and they basically started to include also men.
ZILKA, I said you have time, but you have only 3 minutes.
Okay. And the second initiative is School on Feminism and Religion that started last year. And we offer 10 courses: gender, religion, and peace building. As you can see, feminism in the West and East, gender, religion, and media, etc., etc. And the third initiative is a part now of the university framework in academia. So we have 18 universities on board. We have developed programs, syllabi. We are changing the curricula at the university, and for the first time at secular universities, we have a religious perspective integrated into the teaching process, either as modules or the entire courses. And I would like to conclude this presentation with one of the comic book novels. I hope you can see. This is a piece of art that we use as a tool to address gender stereotypes and also to address this secular religious divide. And I want to thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Şimdi ikinci sırada Ramazan hocamız, Viyana Krems İslam Enstitüsü Müdürü, Avrupa'da yaşayan Müslüman kız öğrencilerin sorunlarından bahsedecek.
Öncelikle herkese iyi günler dilerim. PowerPoint'i açtıktan sonra hemen başlayalım. Çok teşekkürler. Ya ben şimdiden başlayayım, zaman kaybetmeyelim.
Evet, evet.
Avusturya'da 8 sene cezaevi din görevlisi olarak çalıştım. Ayrıyeten de 8 sene okullarda, çok teşekkürler, öğretmenlik yaptım. İlk başta Feryal Hanım'la telefonlaştık, Caner Hocam'la telefonlaştık. Dedim bu konuyu bilhassa bayanların, kadınların daha doğrusu ele alması önemli olduğunu ilk başta belirttim ama erkeklerin susmaması gerektiğini dile getirdim. Onun için de bugün buradayım tabii ki. Çünkü hani bu konu kadın konusu diye kaçamak yapmak olmuyor. Kesinlikle erkeklerin de bilhassa bu dönemde ve bu Avusturya için de geçerli. Ben burada Avusturya'yı tabii ki anlatmaya geldim. Oradaki sorunları anlatmaya geldim. Oradaki kızların ve kadınların sorunlarını anlatmaya geldim. Kadına şiddet kesinlikle var. Kadına baskı kesinlikle var. Ve burada aslında üzücü olan İslam'ı öne sürerek bu işler yapılıyor. İslam suistimal ediliyor. Bu hususta da bilhassa camiler, dernekler, Avusturya geneli için bu hususa daha çok değinmesi gerekiyor. Aileler, seminerler, ZILKA Hanım da demin belirttiği gibi çok yöntemli işler yapılması gerekiyor. Bu hususla ilgili de inşallah seminerin sonunda birkaç noktaya değineceğim. Şunu da söyleyeyim. Geçen hafta Türkiye'nin bir cezaevi müdürüyle bir araya geldik. Oturduk. Ondan sonra işte biraz da dedim işte bu kongreden bahsettim. Ya dedi Ramazan hocam ya dedi şöyle yaslandı. Kadına şiddet diye bir şey yok hocam ya dedi. Tabii ki daha uzun uzun konuştuk. Devamını getirmeyeceğim ama şunu belirtmek istiyorum. Maalesef halen bilinçaltı diyelim insanlarımızda, büyüklerimizde, küçüklerimizde hala bu kadını ikinci kategori olarak görme var. Buna kesinlikle bunu önce bir tespit etmek gerekiyor. Ondan sonra da buna karşı tabii ki adımlar atılması gerekiyor. Avusturya'da şöyle yapalım. Avusturya'da Müslümanların sayısı şu an %8'e geliyor. Yani 700 bin Müslüman Avusturya'da yaşıyor. Nüfus olarak %8 ediyoruz. Lakin cezaevlerindeki sayıya baktığımızda %20'yi buluyor. Yani toplumda %8 Müslümanların sayısı, cezaevlerindeki sayı %20'yi buluyor. Bu konu hakkında da aslında bu konu bugün konumuz olmadığı için detaylı olarak geniş bir şekilde bunu konuşmayacağız ama bu konuya da değinmek isterim. Avusturya'da İslamiyet 1912 senesinden tarihinden itibaren resmi olarak tanınmış ve koruma altına alınmıştır. Zaten şu an orijinal resmi de görüyoruz o dönemden ve Birinci Dünya Savaşı'nda sadece şunu dile getireyim. Aşağı yukarı 40 bin Müslüman şehit oluyor. Sadece Avusturya için savaşıp. Burada tabii ki Avusturya genelinde insanlarla görüştüğümüzde bu bilinç altında halen daha var olmamakta. Yani unutulmuş. Unutulmayan şeyler şudur. Bir veya var olan, hissedilen analizlerime göre bir, İslam düşmanlığı, iki, İslamofobi. Çünkü ikisi de ayrı şeyler biliyorsunuz. Birisi korku, birisi düşmanlık. İkinci etken de Türk düşmanlığı maalesef görünüyor. Bu toplumun yani bütün Avusturya'da yaşayan insanlar böyle demek istemiyorum ama bu izlenimlerimi aktarmak istiyorum. Fobi olan yani İslam'dan korkan çok insan var. Düşmanlık yönünde maalesef her bir insan tabii ki daha fazla ve hiç olmaması gerekiyor ama Bu insanlar var. Ve bugünkü seminerimde de İslam düşmanlığı ve İslamofobi hakkında tabii ki seminer vermediğim için sadece şu sayıyı vermek istiyorum. Bilhassa yani Avusturya Müslümanlar için Dokumentasyon ve Danışmanlık Merkezi ırkçılık raporu yayınlıyor. Ve burada Müslüman kadınlar saldırganların hedefinde olduğunu görüyoruz ve saldırıların %74'ünü kadınlar oluşturuyor. Yani saldırıya uğrayanların oranı %74 ile kadınlar. Bunu dile getirelim. Bizim Avusturya'da 2 bayan var, 2 kadın var. Şu ana kadar senelerdir bilhassa bu konuyu ele alıp kitaplar yazan, sempozyumlar organize eden. Gördüğünüz gibi sağ tarafta Karla Amina Bagajati Hanım, sol tarafta Zeynep Elibol Hanım. Bu bayanlar, bu kadınlar bir deklarasyon yayınlıyor ve binlerce Müslüman kadın imzalıyor. Bu deklarasyon aslında hani ben bugün buradayım, Avusturya'daki durumu aktarmak istiyorum. En önemli şey aslında bu deklarasyon. Birkaç sene önce yayınlandı ve bunu da ben küçük bir şekilde böyle bir en sonunda, slaytların en sonunda bir nasıl desem özet olarak geçmek istiyorum. Ayrıyeten de Asma Barlas Hanım'a çok selamı var. Benim için rol model diyor Karla Amina Bagajati. Onu da buradan dile getirmek istiyorum. Özür dileyerek bir şey daha söylemek istiyorum. Hatta özür dilememe gerek yok. Slide burada zaten. Niye özür diliyorum ya? Burada gördüğünüz canlı bir, yani Avusturya cezaevlerinde Müslümanlar yaşıyor dedik. Bayanlar, kadınlar da yaşıyor. Ve şu sayıyı vermek istiyorum. Avusturya cezaevlerinde şu an 2000 mahkum var, Müslüman mahkum var. Ve bunun yüzde kaçı kadın diye sorsam, şu an düşünseniz, bilmiyorum ne sayı gelebilir. Sol taraftan bir sayı alayım sadece. Yüzde kaçı kadındır mahkumların? %40, 30, %5. %5. Yani bu bence çok büyük bir, nasıl desem, çok büyük bir analiz. Yani şiddet uygulayan kişilerin %95'i veya başka suçlar işleyenlerin %95'i erkek. Yani bunu bir paylaşmak istedim. İkinci paylaşmak istediğim konu da şuydu. O zamanlar tabii daha zayıftık. Manevi rehberlerin ilk adımı nasıl gerçekleşiyor? Bir kadınlar cezaevinden Avusturya İslam topluluğuna telefon açıyor. Ve diyor ki bize manevi rehber gerekiyor. Çünkü Katolikler, Katolik manevi rehberlerden faydalanabiliyor. Protestanlarda da aynı şekilde Protestan manevi rehberlerden faydalanılıyor. Bizlere de Müslüman manevi rehber gönderin. 1996 senesinde oluyor bu. Ve bizimkiler Allah Allah cezaevinde de mi Müslümanlar var diyerekten ilk kadının telefon açmasıyla manevi rehberleri oluşturuyor ve ilk kadın manevi rehber, ya bizdeki ilk manevi rehber de bir kadın oluyor. Ha, bu da büyük bir etken. Hatta cezaevinde son olarak sadece 4 misal vermek istiyorum. Not ettim. Yaşadığım tecrübe olarak aslında üzücü olaylar. Bu 4'ünü aktarayım, ondan sonra da bir okullara geçelim inşallah. İlki bir Türk mahkum cezaevine giriyor, müebbet yiyor. Kız kardeşini öldürüyor. Bu Avusturya'da yaşanıyor. Kendisiyle görüştüğümde diyor ki, ya dedem dedi ki namusumuzu temizlemen gerekiyor. Dini yönden bu senin için bir önemli, yani bir farz. Bunu yapman gerekiyor diyor ve bu çocuk genç, 20 küsur yaşlarında gidiyor kardeşini öldürüyor. İkinci misal vermek istiyorum. Aslında çok üzücü bir olay. Ama hani İslam adına neler yapılıyor? İkinci olayda 16 yaşında genç bir kız. Avusturya'nın en büyük cezaevi Josefstadt cezaevi. Orada kızla görüştüğümde diyor ki ben aslında diyor çünkü kendini öldürenler oluyor cezaevlerinde. Bir senede 10 ila 12 kişi Avusturya'da kendini öldürüyor. Bu sayılar Türkiye'de belki tabii ki daha da büyüktür. Çünkü nüfus olarak da Türkiye daha büyük bir ülke. Ve burada diyor ki kız, ben aslında diyor kendimi öldürmek istiyorum diyor. Çünkü dedem dedi ki bana diyor, cayır cayır yanacaksın cehennemde dedi diyor. Bu doğru mu diyor. Yani bu doğruysa benim yaşamama anlamım yok diyor. Ya bu çok üzücü, bir yandan üzücü ama diğer yandan da manevi rehberlerin aslında önemini arz ediyor. Üçüncü misal, bir erkek cuma namazından sonra, cuma namazlarını kılıyoruz cezaevlerinde. Yanıma geliyor, diyor ki hocam diyor hakimin karşısına, çünkü bizim mesela Viyana'da bir iş işledi, hemen cezaevine alıyorlar, hakim karşısına hemen çıkarılmıyor, birkaç hafta sürüyor ama cezaevinde bulunuyor. Orada diyor ki benimle diyor hakimin karşısına geçer misiniz, söyleyebilir misiniz, kadına şiddetten girmiş içeri, eşini dövüyor. Ya bu Kur'an-ı Kerim'de yazıyor, lütfen bunu hakime söyleyebilir misiniz diyor. Din özgürlüğü. Bir misal daha vereyim. Aslında misaller çok da. 4'ünü bugün için ayarladım, yani not ettim. Bir misalde bir Türk kızı bir erkeğe aşık oluyor. İslamiyetle aslında hiçbir ilgisi olmayan bir kız. Ve sınırda yakalanıyor. IŞİD'e, DAEŞ veya DEAŞ nasıl telaffuz ederseniz. Katılmak üzereyken sınırda yakalanıyor, cezaevine giriyor. Ve bana diyor ki ya orada diyor, siz bir de hocasınız diyor, orada diyor İslamiyet yaşanıyor diyor. Biz tabii ki oraya gitmemiz gerekiyor diyor. Yani böyle tamamen aşık olmuş, körü körüne bağımlı bir kişi olarak görebiliyoruz. Bizim okullara geçelim, cezaevini bitirdik. Okullara geçelim. Avusturya okullarında 80.921 öğrenci din dersi görüyor. Ve 624 din dersi öğretmenlerimiz var. Bayan ve erkek sayıları V weiblich bayanlar, kadınlar, M männlich erkekler. Baktığınızda, analiz ettiğinizde aşağı yukarı aynı oranda. %50-50 diyebiliriz belki. Öğrencilere baktığımızda da aşağı yukarı aynı ama liselerde bayanların daha çok, kadınların, kızların daha çok olduğunu görebiliyoruz. Burada yani şöyle söyleyeyim, Avusturya'da bana misafiri gelen hocalar oluyor çok. Bu Avusturya'daki Türklerin durumu hakkında bilgi istiyorum diyor. Ben diyorum ki Müslümanların durumu hakkında bilgi versem. Çünkü bizim Avusturya'da durumlar biraz karışık. Neden? Bu değişik ülkelerde de değişik aynı izlenimleri alabiliyoruz. Çünkü Avusturya'da Bosnalı var. Hani bizim mesela öğrencilerimizin arasında, benim öğretmenlik yaptığım veya cezaevindeki mahkumların arasında Bosnalılar var. Afganlar var. Ondan sonra Suriyeliler var, Somaliler var. Yani her türlü ülkelerden insanlar var. Ve bu kişiler de ayrı problemlerle gelebiliyor. Benim mesela Afgan bir öğrencim vardı. Dedi ki ben dedi şu an gidersem dedi tatile, lise öğrencisi, geri dönmeyeceğim dedi. Beni evlendirecekler dedi. Elimizden geleni yapıp onu göndermedik. Ama kaç kişi gidip de dönmeyenler var. Hani buna öğretmenler de şahit. Mesela bu problemler hala yaşanıyor. Veya FGM konusunu işledik bugün sabah. FGM konusu, kadın sünneti meselesi. Mesela Mısırlı bazı öğrencilerimde ağlayarak yanıma gelip anlatanlar var. İnanılmaz bir şey. Ama bu hala Avusturya'da var. Çünkü sorunlar hakkında konuşmaya geldim. Veya Çeçen Müslüman kadınların veya kızların bilhassa çile çektiği noktada kadına şiddet meselesi mesela. Çok tabii ki bu burada da genelleme yapma güzel bir şey değil. Hani Çeçenler böyledir, Afganlar böyledir. Bu genellemeyi yapmamak gerekiyor. Ben size sadece aldığım bilgileri aktarıyorum ki birkaç analiz yapalım diye. Bir yandan da İranlarla mesela ilk hafta okullara geldiğinde bizde zorunlu din dersi var ama ilk hafta bir dilekçe yazıp din dersine gelmeyebiliyorlar. Bazı İranlılar unutuyor ve sonra din dersine geliyorlar, oturuyorlar birlikte. Ve onlarda da şunu gözlemleyebiliyorum. İslamiyet'e, İran'ın İslam'a bakışı ve oradaki yaşam tarzı yüzünden İslamiyet'ten tamamen soğumuşlar. İslamiyet'ten nefret edenler bile var. Yani bu kadar ileri gidiyor ve burada aslında biz kendimize sormamız gerekiyor. Biz yetkililer, buradaki bütün kurumlar, hani dini kurumlar, biz nerede yanlış yapıyoruz? Bunu aslında sormamız gerekiyor. Ama ne kadarımız soruyor, ne kadarımız bir şeyler yapıyor, bunu sizlere bırakıyorum. Şimdi Avusturya'da bana sorarsanız şu problem de var. Rol model eksikliği var. Kadın hoca eksikliği var. Ben mesela radikalizm hakkında uzmanlaştım ve nasıl insanlar radikalleşiyor? Sosyal medyada bilhassa. Ve burada maalesef sosyal medya hocalar vesaire hepsi erkek. Ve bu kızlarımız da o erkek hocalardan bilgi alıyor. Ve bence burada kesinlikle ileriye yönelik güçlü kadınlar sosyal medyada daha etkili olması gerekiyor. Bu benim ilk verim. İkincisi literatür eksikliğimiz var. Gençlere hitap edecek literatür. Acayip çok kişi geliyor. Bana hatta hocalarım inşallah yardımcı olur bugün. Çok öğrenci geliyor 20 yaşlarında vesaire. Bana kitap önerin diyor. Burada da mesela bence çok zaaflarımız var. Dil problemi. Niçin dil problemi? Çünkü annenin bilhassa babanın bazen ama annenin Almanca konuşamıyor olması bir problem. Çünkü geliyor öğretmenleriyle konuşamıyor okullarda, komşularla konuşamıyor. Yani şunu söyleyeyim açık açık. Bunu bütün Almanya'ya veya Avusturya'ya gelenler bu izlenimi alabilir. Benim mesela komşum, yan komşum Aksaraylı. Ben kapıdan dışarı çıktım. Ya dedim seçimleri izleyebildin mi dedim. Yok dedi ya daha seçimlere var 2023'te dedi. Yani Avusturya'dan kopmuş. Acun izliyor, Survivor izliyor. Türk berberine gidiyorlar zaten herkes. Yani Türk bakkalı ne derken tamamen onlar aslında vücutla Viyana'da yaşıyor ama akıl ne? Tamamen Yozgat'ta, Çorum'da. Çorumlu olarak onu da söyleyebilirim. Yani problem yok. Yani bu aslında büyük bir problem. Bunu gözlemleyebiliyorum. Cinsiyet ayrımı, erkeklerin daha hür ve özgür yaşaması ve kızlarda yasakların, kuralların, görevlerin daha sert olması. Yani şunu da söyleyeyim, ben ilk çocuğum, 4 tane kız kardeşim var. 5 kardeşiz. Benim eğitimimde de hani annem, babam beni her zaman böyle biraz daha ayrı eğitmiştir. Yani bu da yanlış. Söylemek gerekiyor. Hani bu devam etmemesi gerekiyor aslında. Bunu da açık açık söylememiz gerekiyor. Zoraki evlilikler. Burada aslında bütün problemleri tamam. O ikisini devam yaparım. Kaç dakikam var Feryal Hanım? 6-7 süper hallederiz. Evelallah. Yapılması gerekenleri zaten ZILKA Hanım anlattı. Camilerde problem. Şöyle, ya inanılmaz bir şey. 30 Ortodoks, Katolik, Protestan ve Müslüman öğretmeni ben İstanbul'a getirdim. Bundan birkaç ay önce, 2. ayda olması gerekiyor. Burada bir gezi organize ettik. Çok güzel. Diyanet İşleri Başkanı'ndan da Allah razı olsun çok güzel ağırladılar. Ayasofya vesaire hani böyle çok güzel geçti. Bir yerde Sultanahmet'e girdik. Sultanahmet'te bir görevli vardı. Bir baktım bir bayana bağırıyor. Ama öyle böyle değil. Bayanın da başı açık. Şöyle yaklaştık ama arkamdan 30 kişi geliyor. Şimdi bir baktım o diyor ki erkek diyor ki kıza. Derhal defol diyor. Sen başörtü nasıl giymezsin diyor. O da diyor ki sen önce bir maskeni tak diyor. Ama birbirlerine acayip bağırıyorlar. Ya şimdi araya girdim. Benim araya girmem tabii ki. İşi biraz daha çözdü diyelim. Ya inanılmaz ama şöyle. Yani kız tamamen mahvolmuş. Adam caminin içinde yani girişte Sultanahmet'te şu an tamirat var. Orada diyor ki işte bir bağırıyor inanılmaz. Yani söylemek istemiyorum kelimeleri. Şok oldum. Hayatımın şokunu yaşadım. Bizim de rehber vardı. Geldi. Dedi ki o beyefendiye haklısınız baksanıza. Hepsi Avusturya'dan geldi. Hepsi başörtü taktı. Bu niye takmıyor? Bir de o bayan, o kadın yanımdaki rehber kadının üstüne gidiyor. Ya dedim sen bir dur dedim ya. kadınla dışarı çıktım cidden. Dedim ki ya ben de din görevlisiyim dedim. Sakın dedim, bu görevli zaten, din görevlisi de değil. Normal görevli. Ya dedim sakın hani İslamiyet'ten soğumayın. Ha böyle yaklaşım olabilir mi? Biz diyoruz ya gençlerimize iyi davranalım, camilerden soğabilirler vesaire, bunlar var oluyor. O kız yarın bir gün belki İslamiyet'ten soğar. Ya her şey olabilir. Yani burada da hiçbir, nasıl desem, yani bu bir etken mesela, bir misal olarak. İkinci etken de şu, Avusturya'ya geldiğimizde camilerde kadın maalesef halen ikinci kategori. Cumaları yer bulamaz. Her cami için konuşmuyorum. Ama çoğunluğunda bu böyledir yani. Veya bir arkadaşım anlattı. Burada mesela gelmiş Mihrimah Sultan Camii'nde. Ya dedi arkada kılayım, hani ön zaten kimse yok camide. Arkada sağda şöyle bir namazımı kılayım istemiş. Hemen gelmişler oradaki dayılar, amcalar neyse, çık yukarı veya git arkaya, neyse ne dedilerse artık. Ya diyor ben niye camide namaz kılamıyorum diyor. Ya bu da beni çok etkiledi açıkçası. Şöyle, başörtü problemi var mı? Kesinlikle var. Şöyle var, kendi komşum, o Aksaraylı dediğim mesela, maalesef iş yerine giderken başörtüsünü çıkartma mecburiyetinde kalıyor. Çalışmak için. Düşünün yani bu halen 2022 senesinde var olan problemler. Bizim Avusturya'ya mesela başörtü yasağı getirildi. İlkokul ve kreşlerde şu an kaldırıldı. Avusturya'da peçe yasağı var. Şu an korona yüzünden uygulanamıyor. Yani inanılmaz yasaklar var. Bunu da dile getirmiş olayım. Ve şu problem de var. Mesela Avusturyalıların bir kısmı başörtülü bir bayan gördüğünde ha bu radikal diyor. Radikalizm ile dindarlık arasındaki farkı göremeyebiliyor. Bu da maalesef çok büyük bir etken ki radikalizm, ekstremizm, bunlar da ayrı ayrı ele almak gerekiyor tabii ki. Ama bu çok üzücü bir olay oluyor. 2 dakikam var inşallah. Son olarak da hatta deklarasyonu şöyle yapayım ben anlatırken. Deklarasyonda şöyle bir ilerleme yapayım. Okuyabilirsiniz de. Başarılı bir problemde evlilik konusunu ele almak istiyorum. Başarılı, entelektüel, okumuş kadınların kendi seviyesinde eş bulmakta zorlanıyor. Bu bir problem. Avusturya'da izlenimlerimi aktarıyorum. İkincisi, yabancı uyruklu Müslümanlarla evlenme sorun edilebiliyor. Erkeklere, kocasına bağımlı olan maalesef çok evli kadın var. Hem aile baskısı, çevre baskısı. Bazen de hocalar bile geliyor diyor ki yok ayrılma, ya dövüyor. Ya ben bir misal daha vereyim de ondan sonra pası atayım ben. Fazla okumaya gerek yok. Ya inanılmaz bir şey. Tanıdık diyor ki işte birisinin problemi var. Oturuyorum kafede. Viyana kahvesi de güzel oluyor tabii. Oturuyoruz. Diyor ki benim arkadaşım diyor şu an cezaevinde diyor. Özür dilerim. Benim eşim diyor şu an cezaevinde diyor. Beni dövdüğü için cezaevinde diyor. Ben ayrılmak istiyorum diyor. Ama hocalar dedi ki diyor yok talak hakkı vesaire, sen beklemen lazım, o bir çıksın, bir görüşme olsun vesaire. Ben şimdi beklemem gerekiyor mu diyor. Ve benim eşim anlatıyor, eşim psikolog. Eşim yani çok kişi geliyor işte problemleriyle vesaire. Orada bir mesela bayan, kadın kocasından şiddet görüyor, ayrılmak istiyor. Hocalar diyor ki ya diyor sen sabretmen gerek diyor. Hani bayan hocalar, kadın hocalar ona senin ailen var, çocukların var, sabret daha kal vesaire. Ya inanılmaz bir şey. Allah yar ve yardımcımız olsun. Çok teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkür ederim. Bu oturumda en son Profesör Asma Barlas bize İslam ve Kadın 1400 soruyu sunacak. Ithaca College New York'tan katılıyor aramıza.
Assalamu alaikum, dear colleagues, and thank you to the translator. I will try and stick to the text you have already, which is about 25 minutes long. I'm delighted to participate in this conference on Islam and women, though I also always find it disturbing that 1400 years of living with the Quran has not taught Muslims anything, I would say, true about it. I was, in fact, going to say that I'm frustrated that Muslims continue to harbor so many misconceptions and outright falsehoods about the Quran, especially its position on women. The most common and un-Quranic is that the male God prefers men and wants women to serve and obey them, and even to worship their husbands as their earthly gods, in the words of some popular texts. This, despite the Quran's warning that setting up deities or gods alongside God is a derogation of God's unity, Tawheed, Shirk, the only sin God promises never to forgive. Yet, classical tafsir also portrays Islam as a male-worshipping religion. The phrase is Abdul Wahab Budiba's, on the basis of 6 or so verses out of over 6,200 in the Quran. And though we can read these differently, Muslims usually resist doing so, partly because they consider classical knowledge to be as authoritative as the Quran itself. My point today is to illustrate that this sort of religious illiteracy is produced by the very nature and structure of religious authority and knowledge in Muslim societies. More troublingly, the way these are configured is against some basic Quranic teachings and injunctions. First, though, I should clarify that by illiteracy, I mean the ignorance that educational systems knowingly create, rather than the fact that a large number of Muslims isn't literate, or that those who are don't much read the Quran either, at least in its entirety, according to many surveys. As an example of an educationally bred illiteracy, I'll take my own. I was born in Pakistan and was educated in Catholic convents and a Presbyterian college, like my parents and siblings, and for some years, my son, who is in the audience today. Our first language is English, and speaking now for myself, my worldview for half my life was Eurocentric, in that it was shaped by assumptions of white, European, and Christian supremacy. This is not only because I was taught by European nuns when I was very young, but also because the texts I read presented world history as the triumphant story of the European/Western civilization. And so I never learned that there was such a thing as Muslim civilization, or that it was renowned for its learning and innovations, or that these had also influenced Europe's Renaissance, or that the Ottoman Empire was the world's first modern empire, since modernity is always associated with Western history and the West is always defined in opposition to Islam. In short, my texts didn't mention Muslims or depicted them as villains and a people without history, to borrow a phrase from Eric Wolf. One could thus say that my education suffered from what Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, calls an excess of forgetting some things and an excess of remembering others. I believe the same is true of how Muslims are taught the Quran, through a heavy-handed and lopsided focus on that 0.1% of the text that is taken as privileging men, with little or no mention of those teachings that affirm the ontic equality of women and men, as Rifat Hassan and I call it. This is because, as I will now argue, religious authority and knowledge are steeped in patriarchal ideologies of male supremacy, which predate Islam. The most notable feature of religious knowledge is that it is produced by a small class of male scholars belonging to different schools who present their own perspectives on the Quran as having the same weight as the Quran itself. This transferal of authority is achieved simply by interpreting the text through the Prophet's Sunnah as recorded in the Hadith. As Brandon Wheeler describes it in his study of Hanafi methodology, since the Sunnah, and I quote him, doesn't provide a single definitive interpretation of revelation, and there are conflicting hadith on the same issue, jurists have to justify their own rulings. And they do so by making two unrelated, and I would say stunningly unsound claims, which are first, that interpretive expertise is more important to defining practice than knowledge of revelation. To put it simply, all you need to have is a method, not necessarily knowledge of the Quran. And second, and I quote Wheeler again, that the authority of the practice defined by later generations of scholars is equivalent to the authority of revelation. Obviously, once we erase the distinction between the word of God and the words of men, not just scholars and religious functionaries, but all men, bless you, are implicitly positioned as powerful intermediaries between God and women. The Quran, however, forbids intermediation, and it never says that only men or scholars or Arabic speakers or the literate should interpret it. To the contrary, it urges each believer, including the unlettered, who was also the prophet, right, to decipher God's ayat or signs through our own reasoning and reflection. In effect, the Quran depicts religious belief and practice in terms of a radical individualism and therefore of personal responsibility and freedom, not of institutionalized authority, scholarly expertise, or gender. Further, it forbids compulsion in religion. Yet, Muslims routinely outsource their understanding of Islam to religious figures and, in many cases, force their beliefs onto others, especially women, who have little autonomy in matters of marriage, dress, or travel in several countries. In fact, a dozen of these even maintain a religious police, which is truly an anti-Quranic aberration. Worse, men who commit violence against women justify it as their God-given right, since religious knowledge projects male dominance onto an ostensibly male God, as I said at the start. So on this note, the most, and to me it's still most shocking, Islamic theology violates the precept of God's incomparability by taking the Quran's linguistic references to God as he and him as a license for mapping gender onto God. However, the Quran insists, and I quote, that there is none like unto God, and it forbids even using comparisons to describe God. But instead of disentangling the divine from Arabic pronouns, theologians and Muslims universally collapse the two. Classical tafsir further defies Quranic conceptions of God by implicating God in the sexual politics of the 7th century tribal Arab patriarchy in which the Quran was revealed. It does so by treating the verses about inheritance, testimony, divorce, and marriage as proof that God is partial to men because they are male and has made them superior to women and their guardians. The most well-known of these verses, of course, as we know, is 434, which Muslims take as evidence of God's preference for men and of men's dominion over women, and is allowing husbands to beat disobedient wives. However, as several scholars have pointed out, the Quran's reference to husbands as their wives' kavamun doesn't mean that men are in charge of women. As the verse itself clarifies, the reason husbands are kavamun is because they provide for their wives from the resources God gives them. And this is a point that was made by earlier speakers as well. Also, it is the resources that God prefers to give more of to some men than to others. So God is preferring to give the resources, not preferring men. And lest we forget, God also gives more to some women than to some men. consider the Prophet's wife Khadija in relation to him. As to the idea that husbands can beat wives who are guilty of nushuz, I will first note that the Quran also says that a wife who fears her husband's nushuz can seek a divorce. I've actually never once heard anyone refer to this provision, and I've been on the speaking circuit for over 20 years. Second, as for the word qanitat, which is taken to mean a wife's obedience to her husband, actually, Amina Wadud has made a case for why it only refers to obedience to God. Lastly, there is much controversy over whether the word idribu only means beat or strike, since its root, daraba, also means to leave, separate, cite, C-I-T-E, and so forth. However, the same Muslims who reject such alternatives like to brag that Arabic is so polysemic that it has 100 words for a camel. But apparently it has only one word for daraba, which is to strike the woman and beat the woman. My own position is that the very notion of a God-given male superiority is contradicted by all the Quran's foundational teachings, all of them. Specifically, that God created men and women from the same nafs, named them both Khalifa on earth, and each other's awliya, protectors and guides, that God addresses them in the same terms about faith and moral individuality or morality, holds them to the same standards, and promises to reward and punish them for the same reasons. Here I'll quote two verses that seem to be entirely missing from Muslim public consciousnesses. The translations are by Abdullah Yusuf Ali. The believers, men and women, are awliya, one of another. They enjoin what is just and forbid what is evil. They observe regular prayers, practice regular charity, and obey God and God's apostle. On them will God pour God's mercy, for God is exalted in power, wise. That's 972. The other verse is 35-33. How many people in the audience know it? For Muslim men and women, for believing men and women, for devout men and women, for true men and women, for men and women who are patient and constant, for men and women who humble themselves, for men and women who give in charity, for men and women who fast and deny themselves, for men and women who guard their chastity, and for men and women who engage much in God's praise. For them has God prepared forgiveness and great reward. Did I miss something?
24.
Did I say 35 to 33?
No problem.
Thank you. I thought in Abdullah Yusuf Ali it's 35, 33. I mentioned earlier that I take these verses as affirming ontic sexual equality, a concept that classical scholars obviously wouldn't have known. Still, it doesn't explain why they totally ignore the implications of such teachings in interpreting verses like 434. However, in hindsight, it's clear that the reason they projected ontological male privilege into the Quran is because they applied the hadith to it, and many of the hadith, as you know, contradict its teachings. You've heard that over the last 2 days. For instance, some hadith allege that God made Hawa from Adam's rib, and you know that the Quran doesn't name the woman. And Adama, according to Rifat Hassan, just simply means of the soil. It doesn't mean Adam Brown living down the street from you. Some hadith allege that God made Hawa from Adam's rib, that hell will be filled with women whose bodies are polluting and whose memory is defective, that men exceed women in all aspects, etc. It is also the hadith that deify husbands, endorse female genital cutting, stoning to death for adultery, and face coverings for women, none of which is in the Quran. Of course, there are also some good hadith, like the one that tells a man to treat a woman well, because she's made from his rib and is fragile. But this, bless you, but this defense of women comes at the cost of refuting the Quran's own egalitarian account of creation. Likewise, another hadith forbids men to strike their wives, but the same Muslims who only accept a hadith-based tafsir reject this hadith on the grounds that God and the Prophet disagreed with one another on this issue. But this defense of men's authority comes at the cost of pitting God and the Prophet against one another, which makes for a truly bad theology. Overall then, hadith-based tafsir makes the Quran seem inconsistent. After all, if women are God's Khalifa and men's awliya, in what way are men better than us or superior to us? Along similar lines, if God gives men the right to beat their wives, why does God urge husbands to deal kindly with a wife who is their enemy? Or why does God emphasize that, quote, mates are of like nature and meant to dwell with one another in love and sukoon, a state of mutual satisfaction? Unfortunately, many scholars write off the inconsistencies they themselves create by declaring that women may be equal to men in God's eyes, but they aren't so in men's, which strikes me as an utter heresy, since men do not outrank God. One way to avoid contradictions would be to read the Quran as a totality, as the text itself advocates, by alluding to its own holism, as it says all of it is from God, and by chastising those who hide parts of it while highlighting others for show. That's the Quran telling us how to read it. Another way to resolve the tensions between 434 and the equality verses, as I call them, would be to distinguish between the universal and the particular in the Quran. That is to say, between verses addressed to historical contingencies and those that convey timeless principles. This too would be in accordance with the Quran's references to the, quote, periodic and contextual nature of some of its content. The quote is from Kenneth Craig. However, this is not what scholars do, as is obvious from how classical tafsir treats a 7th century patriarchy not as a historically existing social structure with which the Quran had to deal, but as divinely ordained and therefore as eternally normative. Such a view has had the effect of sanctifying medieval forms of male rule, such that we think men today are entitled to have the same authority over women that tribal Arab men did a millennium and a half ago. However, it's a strange thing to believe that an all-knowing God would not have known that 7th century structures and roles would change over time and would have made them binding on future generations of Muslims. I also cannot see the logic or wisdom of reading the Quran only through the lens of a long dead patriarchy, since doing so undermines its universalism. Significantly, Muslims do recognize that some verses are time-bound. For instance, they believe that since slavery no longer exists as an acceptable practice, the verses about slavery no longer hold. Although putting it this way ignores that the Quran never advocated slavery to begin with. As such, Muslims weren't compelled to have slaves even in the 7th century. By this logic, though, couldn't we say that since the tribal Arab patriarchy to which God first spoke no longer exists, that we also need to rethink men's and women's roles and rights? In fact, I would argue that since there was no concept of rights in the 7th century, many Quranic provisions are just injunctions about good conduct. And where rights do exist in the Quran, it does not link them to a person's sex and gender. And in support of this claim, which might seem very far-fetched, I will offer two justifications. First, I find no evidence that the Quran defines rights, roles, and obligations in terms of gender. And by gender, I mean the cultural symbolism that human beings attach to biological sex. Indeed, there is no concept of gender in the Quran, as Wadud has also noted. The way I put this is that while the Quran recognizes biological differences between women and men, it doesn't assign any gender symbolism to biology itself. What do I mean? There are no verses that suggest males have X gender attributes while females have Y. Nor does the Quran describe obligations and rights in terms of biological or gender identities. Rather, it does so relationally, that is, in terms of social roles and relationships. Mothers, fathers, wives, husbands, sisters, brothers, slaves, the orphans, the poor, the needy, and so on. Second, in describing husbands' roles, the Quran was both adhering to existing conventions as well as modifying them. And not every modification was in the form of a right. If anything, far from extending men's rights, the Quran severely curtailed their authority, typically in favor of wives. For example, it continued to allow polygyny, but restricted it mostly to some wards of orphans on the condition that it would ensure the orphans' welfare. The Quran also urged husbands to treat their wives equitably and limited their number, and it even forbade the Prophet to acquire another wife, even if her beauty pleased him. In general, though, the Quran advocates monogamy. As it says, God has not created for man two hearts. Similarly, the Quran allowed divorce, but forbade men to keep divorcing the same wife, forbade a form of divorce on a wife's appeals, forbade husbands to expel wives from their homes during a divorce, discouraged them from divorcing a wife of whom they had just gotten tired, and gave the wife the right to initiate a divorce. As for idribu in 434, even if we do take it to mean strike, the Quran does not frame it as a right or as an obligatory command. And so husbands don't have to beat their wives to prove that they're good Muslims. After all, the Quran also counsels kindness to a wife from whom husbands fear enmity. Additionally, if a husband accused his wife of adultery on his own witness, the Quran gave her the right to refute his charge on her own witness, and if she did, there the matter ended. Of course, we never hear about this model of evidence giving, in which a wife's testimony trumps her husband's. In response to men's questions about sex with their wives, the Quran admitted its pleasurable nature, but forbade sex with menstruating wives out of a concern for them. It said it's a period of trial for them. Forbade lewd behavior with wives, forbade sex during Ramadan, forbade men to marry women they previously could, and forbade them to inherit women against their will. The Quran's new provisions also radically altered the institution of marriage by treating the wife as a legal entity rather than as chattel, and teaching that spouses are each other's garments whose relationship should be conducive to mutual love and satisfaction. Predictably, though, Muslims not only failed to put any limitations on men's authority, but they expanded it far beyond the Quran by perverting its teachings. They took its passing allusion to sex with a wife to mean that she had no choice in the matter, while curbs on a husband's violence against a wife morphed into a license for all men to beat any woman. Then, too, a reference to husbands as their wives' providers turned into the slander that God is biased in favor of men, and so on and so on. This cultivated ignorance continues to harm women disproportionately by putting them in the position of serving two masters, God and men. Indeed, in societies where men's authority has displaced God's, women are taught to believe that serving men means serving God. If this weren't scandalous enough, women victims of male violence experience God's word as cruel and unjust, since men who are prone to violence disguise their misogyny as God's will. In conclusion, then, the theological and social costs of protecting male supremacy are debased views of God and the degradation of women in God's name. The difficulty, though, is that while many men reject forms of authority that are conducive to shirk and women's abuse, in other words, gentlemen, I don't believe that everyone sitting here wants to beat their wives and generally be difficult. This is to acknowledge that many men don't want that kind of authority anyway, but the problem is that you are in a small minority and we still continue to live in patriarchies. However, if we never develop a praxis of mutual recognition between men and women as God's subjects and each other's protectors, it will also be impossible to honor a collective belief in a just, loving, and merciful Creator. Thank you.
15 dakikamız var galiba değil mi? Soru cevap için. Evet. We have 15 minutes left. Q&A. Yeah. If there are any. Yok herhalde.
Salondan da alabiliriz dilerseniz mikrofonu.
Olur. Yok herhalde.
Rana'nın soru var mı?
Bence al. Yazmaya gerek yok.
Hi, my name is Oturum. I'm a freelance journalist. I have a question to the first speaker from the University of Sarajevo. Sorry, I have difficulty pronouncing your name.
ZILKA.
Throughout your presentation, you were talking about how, feminism itself first is a movement, in order to achieve equal rights for women. But at the same time, in today's world and the media environment itself, being a journalist, I have seen that, we still, and in your presentation as well, like there's a division that you talk about, that there's feminism, there's secular feminism, and then there's religious feminism. So don't you think this division itself is extremely problematic in order to achieve, if you're defining feminism as a movement to achieve equal rights? So do you think at first we need to overcome this disparity that exists in the discourse itself, then maybe we have chances of progressing towards, reaching emancipation that feminist stands for?
Thank you. I hope this works.
Okay, it's working.
Yeah, this is my presentation was exactly about them, to bridge the gap and to overcome that artificial division that doesn't help to achieve gender equality. So, but the problem is, we have to look into the historical development in the West and in other contexts, and then see that secular feminism, especially the liberal feminism from Western part of the world, was imposed as a norm. And then religious feminism in this context was developed later. So it was not acceptable. And I agree with you that there is no point we will not be able to achieve gender equality, we will not be able to achieve a society without discrimination and with social justice if we really don't join the forces, to join all the strength we have in arguments, both secular and religious. But there are problems on both sides. We exclude each other. I cannot say that only secular feminists exclude religious feminists. It's both. Religious feminists sometimes do not want to talk to secular feminists because they consider them godless. They consider them that they don't have ethics, that they are not moral, etc. So there are judgments on both sides. That's why the examples I presented in the end of my presentation are attempts basically to bring together the two and to work together. So it's up to all of us, I mean, both secular and religious, really to enjoy all the forces we have. And it doesn't mean that we will eliminate the differences and that we will agree upon everything. No. But important thing is that we open dialogue and work together, because discrimination against secular and religious women is universal, I mean, so we have to really work together on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Zilka, to you again. Do you think that men have problem with the word feminism, or they don't accept gender equality?
That's a very good question. So I think that not only men but also women have a problem with the word feminism. First of all, they don't understand it. Very often when I talk to men and women who are against feminism, they don't have a clue what is it. They just heard the worst version of feminism, that is exclusivist, that attack men, that is against family, that is against having children and tradition, etc. And very often when I'll just give you an example, in the Bosnian context, when I did my PhD research, I traveled all around the country talking to men and women in local communities. And it doesn't matter whether it was urban or rural area. All male groups I talked to wanted to ask me two questions first. Am I married and do I have kids? And when I said yes, and there was silence. And then I used the momentum saying, okay, now the third question would be how my husband lives with me. Then they laughed and continued talking to me. Why they all posed these two questions? Because they wanted to legitimize me. Men always want to legitimize your position. You should fulfill these positions as mother and married woman, and then you are accepted as a scholar, as someone who can deal with these issues. On the other hand, women don't have trust enough to feminism because they also do not know much about it. They are not exposed to it. And they are afraid of losing even the smallest part of power they have in patriarchy. One of the scholars from Serbia, Marina Blagojevic, calls names that she names it as self-sacrificing micro-matriarchy. What does it mean? Women in the first half of the football match, they sacrifice all their time, all their resources, everything for the family and kids. And in the second half of the life, after 45, in return, they require obedience, and especially obedience from their sons. So that self-sacrificing micro-matriarchy is troubling both to women and men. And we have to get rid of it. So it's not helpful. So I would say that both women and men have a problem with feminism. And I wouldn't say that women are against gender equality. They simply do not know that it's possible to live in different way, but especially religious women, they're afraid of being blasphemous. They're afraid of going beyond what is allowable. They're afraid of offending God because they've been taught that in the name of God they have to suffer, they have to be obedient, they have to really, be second-class citizens. So they think they will not be able to live as a decent believer and someone who is fully submitted to God if they don't submit to a man. So we need to teach them that is possible. And as Professor ASMA said, we cannot serve two masters. There's only one master, it's Allah.
Teşekkürler. Vaktimiz doldu. Kahve arasına gidiyoruz. Yukarıda yine kahve servisimiz var. Okay. Who has the microphone?
Öne gelirler sonra. Problem değil.
Hello, Asma. It's nice to see you here. And the people who knows you on the internet or in America, you are a really good scholar in America and quite famous one. I want to ask you, was it hard to defend and revive your thoughts in America, in the world?
I'm sorry, what was your first question?
Was it hard to defend and revive your thoughts? And let the people who are in the world know it was hard.
Well, I first want you to know that in the US I'm attacked by Muslims, I'm attacked by Republicans, I'm attacked by white people, I'm attacked by some of the Jewish people for being anti-Semitic, anti-Republican, anti-US. I'm always attacked by Muslims. I have too many stories, and I feel like before I die I will share some of them with some people, and I've started to do that, but privately. I have to say it's a thankless task. And I don't know if people know my book in the academy, and there are people who tell me that they're working with it, but in real life, when I go and speak with Muslims, the angriest people with me are always women, and I didn't understand that in the beginning when I started doing this 20 years ago. And my husband, who's a convert to Islam from lapsed Catholicism, he's from Mexico, he said, you can't come into people's lives, just breeze through there and tell them you don't have to obey your husbands and your fathers and your brothers, although I wasn't saying that. But he said, when you raise these kinds of questions, you unsettle people's lives. And what do you think they're going to do? Thank you? So it's a hard life, but I really don't care.
Did you think any time even take one step back at once?
No.
At all? Full force. By the way, I would like to say it's really good to see you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
Nilüfer hocamın bir sorusu varmış. Sonra bir soru daha geldi.
Öncelikle ellerinize sağlık çalışmalarınız için, çünkü çok vulnerable bir gruptan bahsediyorsunuz. Şöyle bir soru sorabilirim. Sizlere destek, Avusturya'da sizin çalışmalarınıza destek olmak için Türkiye'deki kadın örgütleriyle hiç temasa geçtiniz mi? Hani belki de onlarla konuyu paylaşmak isterim. Türkiye'deki kadın örgütlerinin bir katkısı olabilir mi sizin çalışmalarınıza? Teşekkür ederim.
Şöyle söyleyeyim, kadın kolları, yani Avusturya İslam toplumunun bir kadın kolları var. Ve ayrıyeten de Avusturya İslam toplumunda şu an aslında bu da bir yenilik. Güçlü bayanlar içeri girdi yönetim kuruluna. Ve burada son senelerde çok güçlü adımlar atıldı. Lakin Türkiye ile irtibata geçildi mi? Bu hususta şu ana kadar benim izlenimimi söyleyeyim, geçilmedi. Yani Avusturya'daki toplumla bir yol yürünmüş oldu. Ama bu kesinlikle istişare yapabiliriz birazdan. Bir yol olabilir. Faydalanılabilir ama benim düşüncem şu noktada Türkiye'de de durum vahim. Hani biz Avusturya'da durum vahim diyoruz ama maalesef Türkiye'de de durum vahim. Onun için birlikte neler yapabiliriz? Aslında bu hususta geniş bir refleksiyon yapabiliriz inşallah.
Teşekkür ederiz. Zamanımız bitti. Let's have coffee.